got it. Well, so it is, it's 10:03, so we will start. Thank you, Sheriff Daron Hall, for being here. This is about, I think, our fifth one of these. And the first one, Demetria Kaladimas was nice enough to come in and interview me. And so then I thought, well, maybe I can interview other people so I can find out what's going on. So that's kind of what this is. It's just kind of it lasts about an hour. We just kind of talk. There are people listening in, and they'll send questions or comments through chat. But basically, I just kind of have a conversation with you. So thank you for being here. When again, when we first got on, I was going like, everybody knows Daron Hall. I mean, I've known you for years. But I don't know, I was going like, you're from Nashville, right? And the answer is yeah. So obviously your dad was a councilman. Where'd you go to high school here?
Yeah, so I grew up in a place called Bakertown. Now, no one really knows what that is, but it's over off of, I grew up on Luna Drive, which is where the plane crashed, if you remember. My dad was a councilman at that time, but that's the only thing famous ever happened on our street that we could identify with. But over in the airport area, I went to Antioch High School. My mother and father and sister all went to Antioch High School, and so grew up over in what I would call Antioch. Bakertown was a subset of that area, and not very many folks identify that as much. But yeah, just went to school here and went away to Western Kentucky and back in after high school and went to graduate school and studied criminology. It's what I've always been interested in, and came back home, and I've had a pretty it's just a pretty rich opportunity, really. I mean, I just have to, I sit back and think about it. When I landed back in Nashville, I went to work for a person named Fate Thomas. Now, if you've been around Nashville, that's an easy name for people to recognize. But to be honest with you, it was an extraordinary time. I mean, a lot of things were going on. Obviously, he ended up in trouble, but people don't really realize that at that same time, our jail system, our whole system, criminal justice system, was really taken over by the federal court. He got in trouble personally, but that's not really what happened. It was the failure of our whole system, really, this is in the 80s. Here I was, I came as an intern. I wasn't even paid and loved it. I mean, I just thought it was the best thing in the world, and learned had a great opportunity, really, to work there. And, it was complicated. Soon after that, Fate Thomas was beat in the election by a person named Hank Hillen, who was an FBI agent. And he came in kind of this purist, if you will, of wanting everything. And it was very difficult times. I mean, difficult for the sheriff's office to interact well with the council and the mayor. I remember the mayor, Bredesen, took the budget away from the sheriff because he wasn't managing, and he wasn't managing the budget very well. And so then he was beaten 4 years later by a woman, a friend of yours, Gail Ray, who had never even stepped foot in the world of corrections and law enforcement, but said, I'm going to bring a sense of sensibility and business approach to managing and just staying out of controversy, quite frankly. And I didn't know her at all. I was 20-something years old. She asked me to come back and be the chief deputy for her. And I won't ever forget, I've been traveling and doing this line of work all my life, even as a young person. But I remember saying, well, do you want me to do it the way you want to do it? Or am I supposed to know how to do it? Or, because she was new to it as well. And a great experience for me. She was what Nashville needed at the time. The sheriff's office benefited tremendously from what she did, and I was able to learn a great deal in 8 years. I mean, we were running, a complicated operation, and then I was fortunate enough to run for office in 2002, and I've been very, very fortunate to keep doing it. I love what we do.
So for people who don't know what the sheriff does. I mean, we all know that you're the sheriff. You've been the sheriff for 18 years. But just kind of briefly, what is the office responsible for?
Jim, that's my favorite question. I always say my mother doesn't even know the answer to it, and she lives right around the corner because it is complicated. Here's a good lesson though for all of us. So the Metro Charter was passed in 62-3, I think. I forget exactly which year, and that charter basically, built a government of metropolitan government. But what people don't realize is the sheriff is a constitutional officer. It's it originates with the state of Tennessee and the state constitution. The state constitution requires every county to elect a sheriff. So you really can't do away with it, even if you don't like them or don't like me or whatever. You have to elect one. It's complicated because it originates with the state, and then when Metro came around, we as a city had to agree on what were the duties going to be. And of course, that wasn't me personally, but so basically what happened was the two law enforcement agencies, the police department and the sheriff's office, had to come up with where the lines are. This has been tried in court several times. The Supreme Court just a few years ago came out again with this. Basically what the voters said is we don't want duplication. We don't want two school systems. We don't want two law enforcement agencies. So Metro had to draw a line about who has what. And I like to be simple to explain it to people, but I think of it this way. The police department in Nashville makes the arrest of the person. All people are arrested by the police department. You can have some federal people, but let's just say, let's call it Metro Police. The sheriff's office does everything else. Now, that just simplifies it because there's a lot more that goes on to that. Now, for example, we house everyone, no matter what you're arrested for, that they stay with us. And then we serve all the civil law enforcement for the county. What is that? Garnishments, orders of protections, evictions, divorces. There's all sorts of civil work. We have 200,000 a year we're doing in that. So we got people in the field serving civil paper, but they're not authorized to make you or arrest you. In my 24, 25 years of being in the number 1 or 2 spot, it's really clear to me that there's work that could be done down the road to even clean that up even further. I'll give you a great example, and I'm not pitching for this. I'm just saying, for example, the police department do all of the car accidents. There's over 100 a day. So what happens is you bump into my car in a parking lot, you call the police. Well, you and I are paying a fully sworn law enforcement officer to come and fill out civil work when we do all the civil work for the county. And what the courts have said is that the police and sheriff cannot both do the same thing. So meaning they're doing civil work, we're doing, so technically that's probably something we need to fix down the road. By law, the Metro government cannot take away what the state or, state organized or authorized. And so you had to be careful when the charter was written as to who was going to do what. And I think over the years, I've been friends with most of the chiefs of police, and we've transitioned a lot of police duties to us. We do all the booking, for example. They used to do all the booking up until '96. We do all the security for almost every courthouse, or excuse me, all Metro buildings now are either contracted through us or our own people. We do security at hospitals and so forth. So, I always think of it for the public's view is to say, the person who's making the arrest of the individual is a police officer for the Metro Police Department. But really, right after that, everything else is our responsibility. And I think it works really well. Take me out of it personally. I think that's a really good way for government to work.
Okay. All right. So picking up on that, understanding what you do, and also for the people viewing, because, obviously people know, or the people watch the numbers, and I think our numbers today are 4,049 cases, confirmed cases in Davidson County. That's an increase in 41, 43 deaths. And then people, besides watching that, usually take a look at the state numbers, and those numbers recently went up with outbreaks in the prisons. So you run our jail system here in Davidson County. Tell us what's happening. From a standpoint of COVID-19, everything from, what are you seeing to, what steps are you taking to try to deal with this?
Yeah, Jim, this is really important too. I say long-term care, healthcare facilities and jails and prisons really are the most volatile places in the country. I mean, it just is. And that's because, we shut down colleges because dormitories are hard to separate people, from one another. In some ways, a jail or prison is just a dormitory on steroids, right? It has a very, obviously a different role to play, but it's built very similar. And you have trouble separating or if you will, avoiding contacts with many, many people. And so to me, it doesn't surprise me that prisons and jails are where they are in the conversation. There's been some surprises though that kind of jump off the page. Here's a thing to think about too. The higher risk inmate or arrestee, the person who is the most either dangerous or risky or escape potential, whatever. That person is as you would imagine, in a locked down, much more locked down environment, meaning so the person who may escape or harm someone is not walking around in a dormitory and in an open bay type of room. Whereas the person who's, say, a DUI or a shoplifting or, just pick a charge, public intoxication, it doesn't matter. The lower level offenses that aren't risk, if you will, escape and violence and so forth, they live in jails and prisons. They live in a very open environment. And what does that mean? It means that you're basically around mixing with one another. It would look like a barracks almost of a military place. So here's what's happened. The locked down, more risk population you haven't seen that exposure across the country. But when you go into the lower level jails and prisons where there are more people in open space, it is like, a match in a haystack. I mean, it can just take off. And so we've all had challenges. One of the things I'm proud of here is we were aware of it in February or March coming around about getting ready. And so we started right away at trying to reduce our population so we could have the ability to mix and isolate people. When Jim Schulman or Daron Hall was positive, we can't afford to leave you in those same units around all these other people. So we're going to have to move you. And we had some luck on our side. We had a new facility we're about to open, and we were able to use it for kind of a medical ward for 2 months or a month, I guess. And it separated some space. But the places you're hearing so much about, what's happening is those people are not the most serious offenders in our country. I promise you that, because that individual is locked down most of the day because of their risk. But it is true that a prison that has a lot of folks who are working in the yards and out in the communities and various things, that is a very difficult thing to control. And we've been very fortunate here. I don't even like to talk about it because I'm afraid I'm talking about our numbers and how fortunate we've been. But it's a dangerous thing, more so because of the spread. There have not been that many deaths in the country in jails and prisons. I follow this all the time because, quite frankly, the healthcare is right there with you. It is a little easier to monitor it once you're there. But
well, talk to me about. So I know obviously the courts, to most extent, the civil courts are basically shut down. So but people are still coming through the system. So, without disclosing any secrets about how you keep everybody, locked up, what are you seeing coming through? Is there a reduction in the number of people coming through? More people are just not they're being released on their own recognizance. How is all that working for folks? And what can you tell us about that?
That's a great question. So one of the things, and I'll just kind of give you a standard. I've been here a long time. So the standard in Nashville was 100 people a day get arrested. That just became kind of I don't mean a peak, and it's always, by the way, my only thing I remember about graduate school was that crime had a correlation to the sales of ice cream, because the warmer it is, the more ice cream is sold. It's also the warmer it is, there's more crime, at least charged. So therefore, seasonal.
Is there a connection to the ice cream? Because I used to be in the ice cream business.
I knew that. I was going to say, at least timing wise, you did better. I promise you, selling ice cream in July than you probably did in January.
I just didn't want to be connected to a crime spree.
Yeah, we haven't. But I think just if you'll let me use 100 as a base for Nashville arrest at our norm. Let's say 3 years ago, that's probably the number you would look at. We've been working on a thing called bail reform around Nashville and some other things, criminal justice reform issues, for the last 2 or 3 years, long before COVID, that have had an impact on that 100 a day number. I would tell you that the number had gone from 100 to 75, if you'll just let me use that as a number, based on some criminal justice reform efforts. Some of that's bail reform, some of that's enhanced programs of diversions out of jail. There's all sorts of pieces. So let's just say we went from 100 to 75. So 6 months ago, if you'd had me on here and said, how many people we bring in a day? I would say 75 people a day are coming into our jail system. When the COVID situation broke out, I went to the chief of police, the DA, the judges, and the public defender. We were all interacting, but and said, look, it's never said publicly, but really the police officer, who does tremendous work, I'm not arguing that, but is nowhere near at risk like the correctional officer is when this thing takes off. It's much more dangerous to be working around 64 people in one room, all who potentially have it, than one officer making the arrest. I joke about this because they're friends of mine, but the police get a lot of credit for things like they get meals every day provided by somebody. Good for them. But the truth, the front line in this situation is the healthcare community, and quite frankly, corrections and long-term care facilities. It is. And so what's happened is I went and said, look, guys, I have staff and inmates that I have to worry about. I need your help in reducing our population so we can spread this number out. So the police department and all the other players really kicked in and helped. So what happened was I went to Chief Anderson and said, look, by law, you can cite Jim Schulman for the shoplifting. You can cite, there's a law that governs what he can do. I need and ask you to enhance citations where they're not being physically booked on these charges. So, and just to give you a number to prove that helps. So 75 was our number. Last night, there were 29 people arrested. And so, and that's pretty consistent. 30 is a good, so we've gone from 75 to 30 a day right now. And that's really helped tremendously. The flip side is that the courts, judges and DA and public defender, we submit lists of high-risk people, high risk medically for various reasons, list of people who are their sentences are about to expire to try to get them out earlier. We have furloughed people. We enhance pretrial release criteria. The citations have been enhanced. So if you put all that in a blender and turn it on, I'll just give you a number. 3 months ago, we were at 1,250 people in our jail. Today, we have 920. So that number has been driven down. And what that means is I have 1,800 beds in our system, and that 900 number allows me to separate people when Jim is symptomatic or Daron has been tested positive, and that reduces spread. And so without that or an overcrowded system, we would be in a lot of these other situations.
Okay, well, so numbers are coming down. One obvious question, and then I'll go back to the jail. So people would ask, is there as much crime? Is crime down? I mean, I know that, pick somebody up to give them an advanced citation or whatever, but overall, based upon what you're hearing, crime rate down?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me say this is anecdotal to an extent because I mean I watch numbers and I've looked into our own data, for example, and this has been a few weeks ago, but let's just say, I mean DUI arrests, and I'm not trying to be funny, but where are you doing that? I mean, there's no bar open. This is 2 weeks ago. I mean, and truthfully, liquor stores were open, but people weren't driving and drinking and getting out and doing those things. And I'm not trying to make light of this, but people don't break into houses to get the people. They break into houses to take your items they can sell because they're addicted to drugs. Now that's just the bottom line. Well, if we're all at home, people's houses weren't getting broken into. Now don't hold me when you say, well, it did happen. I'm not saying that. I'm saying our numbers are dramatically different. And it's not, I'm not lightening it. I'm just saying you have to realize crime in itself doesn't know where to go when everything is at home and everything is closed. I mean, that's just the truth. And so everything went down. Domestics are something that was going up in some ways. Domestic, we serve orders of protections, and that was going up, I think it was 8 or 9%, which we believe would continue. But so yeah, crime changes a lot in this situation, or changed a lot, but it also took some work on police officers and others. When I pull you over, I could make the physical arrest if you had a crime. But instead, we were really pushing them to say, cite him, give him a court date in July, we'll settle the case down the road. And so that's helped us tremendously. And I think it's important that all pieces kind of pitched in because, it's, as I said, I feel like I'm trying to defend and help the 1,000 inmates and the 1,000 employees roughly that we have scattered all over. And that's helped us be able to do that.
No, that's very, very helpful. So thank you. And, like everything else, really appreciate the fact that people are working together, that you started this early. That's exactly how I think you have to do it. Go back to the jail for just a minute. So your population is down. Obviously, I don't want to jinx anything either, but seems like things are working pretty well. And again, without breaking any safety protocols or whatever, how are you doing it? I know it sounds like you're separating people further out, but that's difficult. I mean, you're talking about 900 people in a facility, along with your officers, and admin folks and everything else. How are you doing it? How are you trying to make sure that you don't have an outbreak?
Yeah, you know, Jim, here's in the health department, we worked hand in hand with them. There's a medical provider inside the jail that works for the health department, lives with us, and I think we've been very fortunate. They've done a really good job, and I think everybody, like I said, my job was to try to reduce populations. Their job, from a medical perspective, that's the experts, is to help, you know, advise us and steer us through this. As you well know, you know, one day you wear a mask. I'm talking about way back. Next day you don't wear a mask. You know, everything was changing. It was very difficult in a jail setting. But so we did some things very early. Believe it or not, you know, disinfectants, bleach, chemicals, cleaning of a jail system is a pretty common thing. You get the impression oftentimes in the media that these are filthy, nasty, terrible places to be. I don't agree with that. And what I mean by that is we have standards to live by. We're inspected by everything in the world, from the health departments to accreditations and everything else. And so it's not unusual for us to have, you know, kind of awareness of what we need to do, because we've dealt with airborne diseases before and bloodborne diseases. So some of that wasn't new to us in getting ready to kind of make sure that we could provide certain cleaning materials and everything to inmates and staff. But to be honest with you, when you start talking about needing gloves and masks for our staff and inmates, which is what I did very early, every inmate, when you get booked right now, you're handed a mask. And if you stay overnight, we give you 2 other masks. Those 2 other ones are longer term masks that aren't disposable. The first one, every staff member I bought, I couldn't find them here. We weren't getting what everybody was telling you nationally. All this PPE is coming to your community. Well, it wasn't coming. I got on the phone in wee hours of the night and called a friend of mine, a sheriff from Florida, and said, "Where did you get those masks?" They actually were for staff. So I bought them. I don't even know what it was. I said, "Oh, you know, emergency purchase, get these here quickly." So we really, I think we're a week ahead in getting some of those things than when the virus actually started to get to Nashville. As you well know, New York and other places we were following was already in trouble, and it gave us a lesson learned. I mean, there were some real things. For example, you know, the testing thing. I was screaming early on, I want all my staff tested, all the inmates tested, I want all the staff tested, inmates tested. Well, what we were learning is the asymptomatic numbers was given a false read on things. And so when our staff were negative today, I mean, our first case that ever happened in the jail had been in jail since February. Well, this was late March. There's no way he contracted it and brought it in because of the incubation period and so forth. So we know that it was an asymptomatic staff member coming in. We take temperatures. We have been for the whole time of every staff, every time they get here, every inmate upon being booked, all the vitals are taken medically. So we were able to kind of watch that, but I've kind of, this is just Daron, but I've kind of given up. I'm not a big confidence in the testing every day, or unless you could do it every day, because the asymptomatic cases were then exposing us later on and we couldn't figure that out. So we've been fortunate. I mentioned earlier the Dormitory Designs, where if it's an open bay area, that's where we had our first case, and we had 2 or 3. And here's the problem in jail. If Jim is in a housing unit with 64 people, which is kind of a standard number, and there's bunks in here, we're all living together, and Jim is positive, or he's symptomatic and is being tested and now is positive, then those 63 other people have to be isolated. Well, the problem with that is you're taking all their rights away, and I'm saying rights in a loose way. They can make phone calls, they can still, you know, but they don't have the freedoms to go to recreation and visitation and these things that you would want them to, because you can't let them be exposing other people. So we were then trying to get those 63 people under a 14-day quarantine while your 14 days of being positive, you know. Well, what happens is you're isolated. Daron, a week later, out of that same unit, starts having symptoms. They test me, I'm positive. Well, that makes those 62 other ones 14 more days. So you could see where this thing can compound. And so what we were able to do, which was very fortunate, is to get those 63 people, isolate them in individual rooms, and therefore there was no risk of exposure for any more. And so to date, and again, we've had, this number moves a little bit. I think we've had 21 total positive inmates the entire time. 17 of those have returned. The other 4 are still in the, what do you call it, the 14-day window. But I think we've had 1 hospitalization. He's back. And 17 of the 21 have recovered and are back in general population. We've had 9 staff members. I believe that's the most of anybody in Metro. We had 9 staff members positive. 7 of those are back, recovered and back at work, and 2 are still on the tail end of their I'm very lucky with that too, Jim.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not an easy line of work, and it's really hard when you have 4 or 5 people working together. One of you are positive, the other 3 have to go home for 14 days. That puts pressure on existing staff, and we just, you're trying to balance that. And very, very fortunate, very, very, very proud of our staff.
No, it sounds like I mean, it's pretty amazing. It sounds like what you all have done and you keep doing. I mean, I think it's, again, I think you're right from the standpoint of, you're talking about a jail situation. And when you start looking at nursing homes and assisted livings, when you've got groups of people together, I mean, those are the things that, again, what you're trying to do is keep it from coming in, because if it comes in, it can infect so many people. So I assume it sounds like you're doing everything you can dealing with people coming in, whether it's your staff or supplies or, you know, vendors coming in to bring supplies, to try to keep it out of those facilities. And I assume you're doing everything you can.
Yeah, and Jim, some of it you don't like having to do. I mean, I'll tell you, for example, visitation. You know, a person who's in custody needs to maintain the relationship with their family. It's important for their next phase of life. It's important for their phase of life right now. And so when you immediately, almost every jail and prison in the country did this, and you have to cut off visitation, because the people that are coming in and out would be as likely to expose the inmate and staff. And so that's not something I like doing, not because, because it reduces or increases tension in the facilities, also reduces the connection to the families. And so we've worked really hard at trying to do other things to try to soften that some with you know, phones. We have tablets for all the inmates. That's always been the case. And we're trying to enhance some of the abilities for those types of programs that we've had to cut off because our volunteers, we have over 120 something volunteers that come in and out of our facilities helping us. Well, you can't do that right now. And so we're trying to phase some of that back in, just like the community at large. But you just hate having to do it. You hate having to take that away because it helps us manage the population, and it helps them, I think, maintain some positive energy versus some negative ones.
You may having the same issue with nursing homes, assisted living. You may actually want to talk to them, because they're kind of in a they're sort of, they would be probably behind you in terms of, you know, you've always had this issue in terms of how you deal with visitation in that type of situation. They never, I mean, they would always have to be careful, but they never had this type of situation where you've got people in a facility that are older, may have dementia, you know, maybe used to having somebody come every day to check on them, and all of a sudden they can't. So you may want to talk. You may want to talk to them.
Yeah.
So let me ask you. Let me add on, particularly because we're talking about nursing homes, more at-risk population within your facility. So, you know, people 60, 65 plus, underlying health conditions. I assume you're taking that into consideration too in terms of what you do.
Yeah, you know, it was good. It was a good exercise. When the very first week that, you know, this thing was rolling, our woman who does all the research, I said, look, you know, go give me everyone 60 and over, you know, and give me. So let's just say at the time we had 1,200 people. It may have been 1,100 something. But let's say that day there were 37 people over 60 years old. So that's not a very common thing. Older people aren't typically in jails. There are some older people in prisons because they're serving longer sentences, but so in some ways that was good. The problem with, and I'm just being candid with you, the charges of most people who are 60 years and older were very serious sex offenses. I mean, to be honest, and I hadn't even thought through that. These aren't easy to release types of cases. And most of these are in court awaiting trial. They're not sentenced, but and that doesn't mean that we don't need to consider them. There was consideration. We sent that through the DA's office, sent that to the public defender, and even the medical staff. And I went to our medical staff and said, forget what they're charged with. Give me the most serious medical conditions we have. And we submitted that. For example, pregnant females. You know, I think there were 8 at the time. I can't remember exactly what the numbers were. Although there was no, as far as I know, there's no medical additional risk, meaning, but clearly we want to be aware of that situation. But yeah, you've got some people who have serious asthmatic difficulties and everything else. And so, although I'm not a medical person, I'm wise enough to say, tell me who is at risk medically as a result of this condition. And so we took that list. We were able to get, I use a number around 200 people released. That wasn't overnight. That wasn't one day. That's been over this whole time, and various types of releases. I keep up with different types that we were doing. But for example, the law allows the sheriff to, quote, furlough anyone. It's a TCA code basically, and furloughs were originally were for a funeral. You know, Jim, here's the situation, or even to be honest, years and years ago, to go to school, go finish it. So it was a law that was on the books, and it was always intended that you would return to the jail or prison, furlough for a period of time. Well, you know, I was trying to be creative, and we were worried about what was going on. We had 8 people who were working in work release. They worked at Wendy's or McDonald's or wherever during the day. Then they would come back to the jail at night and stay and finish their sentence. Well, I didn't want them to lose their job by cutting them off from going to work. And so on the other side, you know, so I furloughed them, those 8 people. And just so everyone knows, I'm not naive. I've been here a long time, and I know that everyone's not going to do what they're supposed to do. And we have an agreement with them. And so one of those 8 just comes to mind. And, you know, a week or so later, family members of that individual called us and said, hey, we're concerned about him. He's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. We went and picked him back up. He's back in our system. He was using heroin, and so the point is, you're trying to do the right thing, but we're balancing public safety and public health, and trying to balance that is difficult.
So let me ask you a little bit, because a couple of questions came through on bail reform. You obviously been working on it. Where is it, and has it, in terms of bail for people, have the courts been cognizant of that as well in terms of this situation?
Yeah, you know, and this is, I say luck. I mean, I think given COVID and when it's here, we're so lucky that the bail reform thing started, I think, 3 years ago, as far as officially getting involved, because the numbers did drive down. There were serious conversations with commissioners and judges and everyone else about bail and why and how it's important, and poor people shouldn't be in jail because they can't afford to get out. That's not what bail is supposed to be. And so we had a lot of those conversations. And what was ironic was there was some progress, I think significant progress made over the last 2 to 2.5 years on it. And then when this surfaced, this situation, and we were going and asking for early release or emergency releases or reductions in bond, that conversation was, I hate to say easy, it was very clear that here's a good example of why we need to have bail reform, because certain cases, you know, don't necessarily need to be physically in jail. But yeah, so just real quick, I left college when I was a junior and went to work for the state of Kentucky for a year, a long time ago. And I worked for a program called pretrial release. The state of Kentucky outlawed bail bondsmen in 1972. They do not have a cash bail system. And it is all managed by the government. And I worked for them for a year, and I loved what they do. I think they have a really good system. And it's better than most other cities and situations. I came back to Nashville, went to work for the sheriff's office, worked in pretrial release for a year or two right off the bat, and have always had a passion and interest in that subject. So about 3.5 years ago, the then public defender Don Diener and I applied for a grant basically to overhaul pretrial release. Basically what that means was we had it for 25 years since I even worked in it, and the criteria hadn't changed much. To be honest, it worked, but we didn't enhance it at all. So we got a grant, and that grant basically was 3 years and allowed us to go study around the country to figure out what the best new kind of the new wave of pretrial was, and what do we need to do? You know, how do we need to fix it? And so we hired a new person in the agency, turned it over to her, let her spend a year traveling, and I don't mean traveling all the time, but looking throughout the country to gather new criteria. Here's a great example. When I worked in pretrial, Jim Shulman's arrested, and I'm talking to Jim. I'm interviewing you about getting you out, and I'm saying, okay, Jim, do you live in the county? That was a requirement. Do you have a job? That was a requirement. Do you have family here? That was a requirement. Well, if you hit all these marks, then you're free to go, and I'll see you in court in 2 months. And then I'd call you along the way on the phone and say, Jim, remember your court date's coming out. Well, if you think about that, 30 years later, so much of those things are ridiculous. One of them is living in the county is ridiculous. Half our employees don't live in the county. So I mean, the county line doesn't mean what it did 30 years ago. But probably the most important one, and research shows this, is that the most likely indicator that a person will come to court if you release them on a program is if you text them. Well, I have a 25-year-old, I have an 18-year-old. They wouldn't know how to call you or probably even answer their phone if you call them, but they can text anybody and they communicate. And most people going to jails are in that age category. And so if you think about it, me notifying a person 25 years old to be in court via text is how they live. calling someone on the phone and getting them to remember it is not worthy anymore. And so that's one example. So everyone's court dates are now text to them. We're monitoring that. We do not require you live in the county. We broadened that whole thing up. It's been a little while. COVID kind of screws up some of these numbers because of all the releases, but we doubled the percentage of people that were getting out on pretrial in a year. What that meant was 10% of all arrests were going home on pretrial. By the way, some are making bonds still like they wanted to. We don't deny that, but and then now we're getting 20% out just on pretrial alone. And other people, again, if you got arrested right now and you want to make bond, you can pay a bondsman and get you out right away. You don't have to be interviewed and do all this stuff for us. But what pretrial is supposed to do is to take the financial aspect out of it. That's what it's about. Are you a risk to come to, be in court or not? And it shouldn't matter how much money you have. I'm often criticized in the bail bonding world because I say this all the time. Money is not proof that you're going to show up. It's just never been. That's not really what it is. And so we use it in our society. And don't forget, bail is constitutionally required. I mean, you're guaranteed bail. You're also guaranteed not to have cruel and unusual punishment. What does that mean? Well, if I leave you in jail because you can't afford to pay, but you would come to court, then I've really done what I think is as a society the total wrong thing. And so I believe, if I talked in analogies, I would say that we have, if 10 was the perfect score on total bail reform, I think we're at a 7 or 8 today on many things that have gone into that. Judges used to never ROR release someone. That means when they look at you and they say, hey, I'm gonna release you on your recognizance. A lot of communities have hundreds and hundreds of people released on recognizance by a court and a judge. We hadn't had that happen much in Nashville until these conversations, and now RORs are a big part. Pretrial release is enhanced, and you still have an opportunity if you want to pay a cash bail to do that as well.
Interesting. Interesting, and I appreciate the answer. I know a lot of people are interested in that. Good for you. Good for you for working on it. That's good. So you see me moving around. I've got different things popping up, telling me what I'm supposed to be doing. I did want to recognize that Councilmember John Rutherford is on the call today. Thanks, John, for being there. Jason Mumpower, Deputy Comptroller, is on the phone from the state. And our own County Clerk, Brenda Wynn, is on the call.
Oh, all right. Well,
thank you
hello
all
to everyone
for doing that. Let's see. So usually about this time, about 2/3 of the way through, it's about 10:40, so we got about 20 minutes left or so. I then spring into those big questions that I was holding back. So we're going to get into kind of what do you see happening over the summer and the fall. But the first question, which is always a difficult one, is about kind of ICE. And what can you tell people? I know that people get, it's a very difficult subject. People are extreme on different sides. But what can you tell us? What's going on?
Yeah, that's good. I appreciate this too, because this is a subject that's confused or has been confused for various reasons over the years. And so the sheriff's office role with ICE is limited to what is required by state law. That's the first thing. There's no discretion here on the sheriff the way my lawyers and Metro Legal and others, I think, have interpreted that. There's a law at the state level that requires people who are being arrested and booked. The sheriff's office, no entity, can prevent cooperation with federal immigration authorities. So what does that mean? The fingerprints are shared, not because I decided to do that. That's an electronic system that was put in under President Obama. And so those prints are back and forth with ICE. If ICE sends us a warrant and a detainer on an individual, then I'm required by law to honor that. All that really means is hold that detainer until the local charges are done. I haven't looked at this in a long time, but back just a few months ago, I mean, that was 1% of the people of all arrests. Just to kind of put that out there. The other thing that kind of happened, this was in late November or early November of last year. I discontinued a contract that we've had for 30+ years since I've been here of allowing ICE to house people here. Now, what people were confused about was that was enhancing ICE's participation or whatever. I can't speak to that. What it had been used for over the years is that if a person was arrested locally and ended up in the custody of ICE, they could stay here. And what that means is I got a DUI and I'm also wanted by ICE. So what would happen is when a DUI time finished, then I would or could stay here 4, 5, 6 days, whatever the number is. And then ICE would make arrangements to transport me from here. So those 5 days, I'm just using an example, those 5 days were reimbursed to the county, not to the sheriff's office, but to the county. And it didn't require that person who had the DUI, when they're finished with local time, to immediately be turned over to ICE. It allowed that to happen. I spent many hours with many advocates about this on really not both sides, but on both sides of the issue. And saying, look, I want everybody to understand if we discontinue that contract, the individual may probably be sent away much quicker and the families aren't able to stay up on what's going on. Now that's my belief that was going to happen. That may not be worth continuing it. But after meeting with the advocates, I spent a lot of time with Turk, Councilmember Mendez. I met with Vice Mayor Schulman and others and said, look, here's kind of what we're doing and what I was thinking what we could do to kind of end that contract. So, and we did that in November. And one unfortunate timing issue was we were trying to enhance the U.S. Marshal contract. At the same time, we're doing away with ICE. I want everybody to understand what that means. The U.S. Marshal are people who are criminally charged with federal crimes, bank robbery, drugs, whatever, and they're federal criminal cases. ICE was not a criminal case. And so what we've done here is the U.S. Marshal contract has to do with housing people who are going to our federal courthouse for criminal cases. And then the county, not the sheriff's office, the county will be reimbursed for that money. And so we've done away with ICE. There are no more housing of anyone for ICE purposes. That discontinued in November. And but we are housing U.S. Marshal people that have nothing to do with ICE. That's all I wanted.
So let me ask you a question about that, because so that I'm clear on how this works. So it used to be somebody gets arrested for a DUI, do the fingerwork analysis, everything else, whatever, fingerprint analysis, and turns out that they're wanted by ICE. In the old system, then something would come in. It would be a detainer warrant, and it would say, we want you to hold this individual after his or her local time is taken care of. Now that we're not housing folks, what happens?
Yeah, so, and that was kind of the risk or the worry I had. So Jim Schulman's arrested, he's booked, he's got, we receive a detainer warrant on you that they want you when you're done. And so when your local stuff is finished, let's say tomorrow morning at 12:01 in the morning, your 10-day sentence is up. So we notify ICE, they actually are aware that your time is up anyway, but we notify ICE, and there is a law, 48 hours, that is the most you can be held. Just for your purposes, we notify them that we're preparing to release them 40 hours later. Just that's a timing thing. It takes a while. So if they don't show up on the 48th hour, we turn you loose into the streets, wherever you want to go. And that's completely up to ICE. Here's what makes it a little problematic for people that let's just say a year ago now, in that same scenario, your local time is up, and then ICE isn't going to fly right over here and pick you up when your local time is up. They may move that next week or the next week or the next week. And we were aware that families and other things can get worked out in visits and conversations and all that while you're still here going through that. My worry in this whole situation is if you pull that opportunity away, the minute local time is up, it is, almost assured that ICE is going to zoom over here and pick them up within that next 48 hours really quickly. It could be 2 in the morning. It could be within 48 hours. I don't mean they have to wait for it. So they could come 5 seconds after your local time. And that's kind of a difficult, but again, advocates expressed to me it was worth it. I spent a lot of time, more time on this conversation than probably I should over the years. And it's not, and again, keep in mind, the money was never the sheriff's office, and the law dictates that I have to cooperate. Now, what level of cooperation? I'm still doing the same thing. The contract just allowed the individual to stay here, to be honest with you. It didn't, so ending the contract did not shut us off from dealing with ICE, because the law makes me do that. It just doesn't allow people to stay here. That's really what it does.
And the requirement of again, when people come into the system and doing all the work analysis, that's all required by federal law.
Yes.
And then the requirement of when the local time is coming to an end, the notification period and the 48-hour period is also federal law. That's a requirement.
Yeah, so it's good. It's really good for people to know. So, and I say President Obama for a reason. I'm not trying to politicize this, but just that's when this happened. Under President Obama, every arrestee's fingerprints are automatically shared with ICE. Okay, so that what that means is those two systems talk. Right now, if you're booked in jail, your fingerprints are immediately sent to the FBI to make sure you're not wanted for, murder in California, and that goes to the criminal justice system's database, and it tells us immediately is Jim Schulman wanted. Well, what the President Obama thing did was it took those same prints and sent them a different direction, which was into the immigration system, and say, is Jim Schulman wanted in this system? And so that was done under President Obama. So the sharing of that information is a biometrics automated, mandated system. So now, so the prints go that direction. Well, what the state of Tennessee did was it passed a law 2, 3, 4 years ago, I forget when exactly, that says that I must cooperate. Now that the prints have gone over there, if they send me a document and say, hold on to Jim Schulman, it is a Class A misdemeanor, I believe it is, for me to say no to that warrant, right? The law is clear. It's called the Anti-Sanctuary City Law, written by the legislature, passed by the governor. So it is on the book. So I have to follow the state law when it comes to cooperation. And if you want to call it federal law, it's really federally shared information under the Obama administration. So those two factors, the way our lawyers have interpreted this is that I must cooperate once they send me the detainer warrant. And so we do that. The part that's not required by law was the contract to house you once the feds want you. And that's what we discontinued.
All right. And the 48-hour requirement, just so everybody knows, is a federal requirement?
Yes. Okay. Yeah, what it is, it allows ICE 48 hours federally to come. I mean, I came here 32 years ago, and I remember back then how that worked was if you were being booked 32 years ago, you're from Canada, we would call INS back then and say, hey, we have a Jim Schulman, he's not from the United States. What do you want us to do? They drive over here, and they have 48 hours to talk to you. That's kind of that's where it's years and years ago. And that 48-hour window is for them to determine, are they interested in you staying here, under some sort of charges. So that 48 hours starts ticking the minute you're done locally. And that gives them time to figure that out.
Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So I appreciate you taking so much time. That I know that's important to people, and I appreciate you talking about it. Okay. So now we got 10 minutes, and I will tell you that I started, I don't know if I have the number right, but under your scenarios, I've been arrested 11 times.
Well, hey, I'm all about rehabilitation. We're going to work on that.
All right. But we still have 10 minutes, so it could go up during that period of time. All right. So we are where we are right now. Understand all the work that you all are doing. The numbers have decreased. The bail reform. You've got a new jail that you're utilizing to some extent, but obviously, I assume it's not really truly functioning at this point. You're still waiting to open it up.
Well, Jim, that's good. That's something I probably need to get out as well. On Mother's Day morning, just ironically, it landed that way. We began what you and I would call booking the process. So that was the first. So what is that? Last Sunday? I forget when that is. Yeah. Last Sunday. So that was really our first, what you and I would call operational day. I haven't looked today, but we probably have 400 or so people in the facility. It holds 750, and so it will eventually we'll move some more folks, but it's operating the way it should now as of last Sunday after months and months of waiting to get it done.
No, thank you for telling me that. Didn't know. Okay. Yeah. All right. So last big question. Again, we are where we are. City's reopening. The courts are still, the civil courts are closed, and criminal courts are functioning. And your new jail is now starting to open. Summer and fall, you don't know. We don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Okay. So here we go. We'll see what happens. They're watching the numbers, blah, blah, blah. What are you ready in case something happens now, or what are you going to do about the summer? And if this thing comes flying back in the fall, are you prepared? Are you ready to go?
I think my answer is hopefully, and I say that because there's two things that have been helpful. We have a lot of PPE. We have a lot more equipment than we didn't have. It's still arriving. We're getting that, and that's good and helpful. I mean, let me give you something no one probably ever thinks about, but we once a person is positive in a housing unit, then that officer is wearing basically a full hazmat suit to work with that inmate all day. Well, what ends up happening is the individual's in a cell, the inmate is, and I have to come and take your temperature. I have to come and feed you. And every time we open that door, we have to change our hazmat suit. We're using 12 suits a day per inmate. When you think about changing shifts, changing people. So just the volume, again, and we've only had 21 cases, but it's extensive, the amount of stuff you would use, gloves and masks and cloths and so forth. So we have a lot more of that. We're prepared in a much better way on our PPE equipment than we would have. I think we've had some lessons learned that would help us. I mean, I can think of things that would probably, for example, the medical staff have advised me, when you'd be 101 temperature and we would test you, you'd be negative, and we would think we're good. Well, what we've learned medically is that thing may be 2 days away from reading positive, so we don't need to. And it's just lessons learned in movement and shutting down some of the things we do. But it's, and I don't mean to choose sides. I'm more worried about the staff, and here's why. It's not whose life is more valuable. It is that is going to be much more difficult to manage, I think. And here's why. When you have 450, 500 staff who are essential personnel working in the jails all over Nashville, all sorts of capacities. When you start having 10 to 15% of those people potentially positive or out with exposure, you don't have, I can't just call someone across the street and say, come over here and do this. And there aren't other places in the government that can come in and move and do it. So you're so limited that if you don't control the spread within the staff, and I'm just, because you and I are working in the same hallways and so forth, it is far more, I don't mean dangerous, it's far more difficult when you're having that than it is really the inmates. Here's the reason why. You can isolate the inmates. That's actually what they need most, right? We're basically isolating people at home right now when you tell them to stay home. Well, we can isolate them. They have medical staff direct hand-to-hand all day long with that person. Quite frankly, maybe the best healthcare situation they're going to be in, just because it'll be better than what I have, because there's nurses on site 24/7. Our staff, not so much, right? You're trying to balance this. They have a temperature. You stay home today. Go get a test. See if it's positive. And you do that times 10 to 15 to 20 people, and that turns into 50 or 60 people who are exposed to them. Our entire workforce, and this is true in some other places, can really be depleted very fast, and that presents a lot of dangerous and difficult situations. So, that's the thing I worry more about. It's not because them over the inmates. I'm not saying that, but their likelihood of exposure in the community and at work is tremendously high. The inmate, we can control who you're exposed to. Our staff, because we're asking you to drive people back and forth, hospitals, courts, come, go. It's going to be very difficult. And that's something that, like I said, I think we have the most positive cases in Metro, and we feel pretty fortunate on our numbers.
Let me ask you this: are you all still, having some calls with police, chief, sheriff, the courts, public defender's office, the DA? Still, this is one of those things where, because it's, as well as I do, every day, you turn on the news, it's like, oh, here's something else. And so, you're staying up to date with each other and still kind of working through all this stuff.
Yeah, Jim. And I had lunch with Chief Anderson. What day is it today? Friday, Saturday. So yesterday, day before, I forget, very recent. And today's challenge, or that day's challenge, what does this order mean? Does our staff have to wear a mask everywhere they go? In the office, out of the office, down the hallway, in the restroom? How do you eat? Where do you go? I'm not trying to be silly. These things are complicated, and the public have an expectation of law enforcement, or what we would consider ourselves, that's a little different and higher on the bar. That's okay. But you get out and pump gas, you have to wear a mask. If you're an officer, how do you communicate? And that's today's challenge, and that's because we owe our staff clear direction, and then enforcing that on them, because the public have expectations. And I'm frustrated as a citizen, because I need consistent messaging, and I don't mean from a mayor. I think the mayor's doing fantastic. Let me get that out of the way. But just today, 24 hours, we have our governor, who I think is doing a great job too. I'm not picking sides here, but is opening up retail and restaurants, and I can see out my window right now another county. I'm not close to another county, and so all that's going on. Our employees, 40% live in those counties of my employees. So there's rules in one place, and then when you get to work, we're going to tell you, it just feels like that's very difficult. Unfortunately, people need constant, consistent messaging, and this thing hadn't provided that. Just difficult.
I think in the end, again, after this initial phase, I think we're all doing it. We're all trying to get those lessons learned and everything else. So anyway, I appreciate you doing that. So I think we have time for a real quick last question. I will say that your son Dylan has logged on. He's been watching you. So
well, I don't ever get to see him. Hey, say hello. I thought.
Well, there you go. And I will tell everybody that Secretary of State Trey Hargett is going to be our guest next week. So people should tune in. He's going to be talking about elections and voting and absentee voting, which should be kind of interesting.
Right.
Okay, last question. So you've been involved in something really, really interesting in terms of the behavioral health aspect of what you're doing. And so we had a question that said, have you been able to start this, particularly because I knew it was going to be a part of the new building. So where is that?
Oh, Jim, that's been my passion and it's so disappointing kind of just because of what's happened. But the bottom line is this, 30% of the people being arrested in Nashville, just like any other city in our country, are diagnosed mentally ill. No other modern country in the world would be putting you in jail for being off your medication. If you're naked in a park in England or Australia or Germany, they view you as you need help, something's wrong with you. In our country, we view that as a crime. We call the police. It's not the police fault. There's no discretion. I mean, where are you going to take them? There's not been an alternative. And so I got tired of complaining about it, frustrated for years. We've had a lot of good things going on in Nashville over the years, but to be honest, I'm seeing this because we house that individual, and I know jails are not suited to do treatment for mental health. And so in some ways, I like to say this kind of tongue in cheek, but in some ways I lied to the council, I lied to the mayors, I lied to the city and said, I need all this money for a jail. Because part of me said, we don't need to be putting these people in jail anyway. And so instead of coming and trying to explain all that 5 years ago, I said, if I can get this jail money, I'm gonna build what we need. And I'm not a construction guy, but I do know what we need. And I went into the construction people and said, let's build what we need. And so what we've done is on that same piece of property that an old jail was stood on and a new jail was to be built on, we took about $10 million out of the jail money and built a behavioral care center. And so what happens as we go, this will start in July, the jail just opened. What will happen is, and I'm not trying to be funny, but if Jim was naked in the park, then what happens is historically he'd be brought in, he'd be fingerprinted, photographed, taken to court, convicted, assigned a probation officer, and just so you know, 12% of the time a person who's mentally ill makes probation successfully. So that's just a ridiculous idea. This basically takes you out of the criminal justice system. Upon arrival, you'll be diverted directly into the hands of a mental health co-op. It is a beautiful facility. It gives me chills every time I walk in there, and it's going to do great things. I mean, and it because what it allows us to do, it's not going to cure mental health and mental health issues. It will decriminalize it. That's what I want to do. I just don't believe you should be criminalized for being ill. And so it gets you out of there. You don't have fingerprints and photographs and court dates and probation officers and fines that you owe and all this stuff. And a judge, not their fault, a judge wagging your finger and a DA and a sheriff going, what are you doing? This is really about mental health. And so if you diagnose mentally ill, you will be moved into the behavioral care center. You'll be treated and handled by mental health and then released with follow-up care in the community. And, when things get more, settled, I hope Nashville can really get to focus on the conversation. We have a chance to do some really good things.
Well, so I very much appreciate that and the information. I knew that was coming. I know people were interested in it. So thank you for doing that. If depending on what happens, we're all learning. If we continue these chats on Saturday, we may have you back in a couple months and see how that program's going. But thank you for doing that. Daron Hall, our sheriff, thank you for being on this today. You've been really, really informative. A lot of good information. I just appreciate you taking the time on a Saturday morning to spend an hour with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your service, Jim, and thank you for doing this. I mean, it sounds silly, but essential business is getting essential information out, and whether we're essential or not, I don't care. But you're doing great and trying to get this information to the community. So thank you for having me, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thanks. So everybody, again, our Sheriff Daron Hall, we will be on next Saturday at 10 o'clock with Trey Hargett, the Secretary of State, to talk about elections and voting. So everybody have a good week, a good weekend. It's beautiful outside. Go get some fresh air. Enjoy the weekend. Have a safe weekend and a safe rest of next week. And we'll see you next Saturday. All right. Thanks, Daron.
Take care.